Welcome, everyone. My name is Sean Randall Travers. The pronouns I use are he, his, and him, and I am the Executive Director of EDI Learning and Professional Development. Before we begin today, I would like to point out the accommodations that are available for this webinar. There's closed captioning available. Just click on Captions in your menu and select Show Captions. We also have ASL interpreters on video today. If you follow the instructions on the slide to change your view setting to side by side, it should work well for you. There is also simultaneous translations in Spanish. Just choose interpretation in the controls and select Español. Simultaneous interpretation is being provided to and from Spanish. Seleccione interpretación en los controles del webinar y seleccione Español. If you do not understand what I just said in Spanish, please use the interpretation feature. To do that, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are and click on the interpretation icon. It's a world, and select English as your language. If you are joining through a Zoom mobile app, a cell phone, tablet, or other mobile device, please press the ellipse, those are those three little dots, and then interpretation, and then choose your language. I want to acknowledge the land we are on. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. Thank you for joining us today for the continuing events in the Tritons Belong series. If you'd like to learn more about the Tritons Belong series, the in-person workshops on dialoguing across differences, our online events, and other related resources, please visit our webpage at diversity.ucsd.edu/Tritons-belong, which we have also provided in the chat and at the QR code on the screen. It is now my honor to introduce UC San Diego's Chancellor. At UC San Diego's Chief Executive Officer, Chancellor Pradeep K. Khosla, has positioned the institution to define the future of the public research university. He activated the institution's first ever strategic plan and completed an ambitious 10-year campaign for UC San Diego, a $2 billion endeavor that raised over $3 billion and has successfully transformed the university physically, intellectually, and culturally. These efforts have shaped UC San Diego into a university that is student-centered, research-driven, patient-dedicated, and service-oriented, and a preferred destination for students, faculty, researchers, patients, and the greater community. Under his leadership, UC San Diego has expanded college access and affordability for underserved students, initiated campus-wide interdisciplinary research initiatives to foster collaboration and solve societal changes, and strengthen university and community partnerships to drive regional impact. Welcome, Chancellor Khosla.
Thank you, Dr. Travers, and hello, Tritons, and welcome. Earlier this year, we launched a series called Tritons Belong, and the focus was on building understanding and compassion in these very challenging times. Through the series, we have spent time learning about dialoguing across differences, as well as concepts of free speech and academic freedom, both of which we hold dear. At UC San Diego, we'll always stand in solidarity against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism, and against all forms of hate, discrimination, and intolerance. Our discussion this morning will first focus on Islamophobia. Learning more about this form of hate will help us understand what we can all do as individuals and as a collective to combat it. And this afternoon, our discussion will focus on anti-Semitism. And as we hear these discussions, I want to encourage you to approach these subjects, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, with a curious spirit around what you may learn. And I challenge you to consider what Islamophobia means to you and for you, what it means for those Tritons who identify as Muslim, and what it means for all of us on our campus and to our campus climate. More importantly, we will learn how to avoid harmful assumptions and biases towards valued communities. These discussions are fundamental to the connections we build with each other when practicing our principles of community at UC San Diego. We must express our views and engage in conversations about issues of significant importance in a manner that honors the inherent dignity within each of us. And this means listening to one another with empathy, with compassion, with tolerance. And even when these diverse beliefs and opinions are deeply rooted, such conversations can be uncomfortable. Because in doing so, we promote belonging for all members of our Triton community and deepen our understanding and compassion for one another. So we actively cultivate a community in which everyone feels a sense of belonging, and we commit to learning, to supporting one another, and to working towards mutual understanding. So I encourage you to continue your learning and your understanding of Islamophobia and of anti-Semitism through this series within your communities. Because every Triton, and I mean every Triton, belongs at UC San Diego, and you all belong at UC San Diego. So let me just finish by saying a sincere thank you to our Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Becky Pettit, and to her leadership team, and for her leadership and her convening this very important and critical conversation. So here we are, Dr. Pettit, on to you.
Thank you, Chancellor Khosla. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today for the next session in our series. In February, we held our first sessions focused on dialoguing across differences in times of conflict, as well as free speech in times of conflict. Attendees shared that they found those sessions informative and useful in their own practice. We now have recordings of those sessions available on our website. A link is going to be shared right now in the chat for you to review later or to share with others who you think may benefit from the content. Later today, as Chancellor Khosla mentioned, I invite you to join us for our session on anti-Semitism. That link is also going to be shared in the chat right now for you to register if you'd like to join us for that session. Today, right now, we're going to focus on the important topic of Islamophobia. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. Maha Elgenaidi. Maha is the founder of the Islamic Networks Group and is currently its executive director overseeing the organization. She is the author of training handbooks on outreach for American Muslims and leads educational seminars for public institutions on developing cultural competence with the American Muslim community. Maha received an MA in Religious Studies from Stanford University and a BA in Political Science and Economics from the American University in Cairo. She has taught classes on Islam in the modern world in universities such as Santa Clara University and UC Santa Cruz. She has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Civil Rights Leadership Award from the California Association of Human Relations Organizations, the Citizen of the Year Award from the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, and the Dorothy Irene Hyde Community Award from the NAACP in Silicon Valley. She is currently an advisor for the California Commission on Police Officer Standards and Training, and a member of the Council of Advisors for the Freedom Forum that provides education on the First Amendment, and a commissioner on the Hate Crimes Task Force for the County of Santa Clara. Please join me in welcoming Maha.
Thank you so much, Becky, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask my colleague to start the PowerPoint so that we can jump right into it. So the title of this presentation today is what you see there on the slide, Islamophobia and its impact on Muslims and Arabs. Before I get into the discussion on Islamophobia, I'm going to first define, next slide, who are Muslims and Arabs. So next slide. I'm going to begin with Muslims first. Muslims essentially represent about 1/4 of the world's population who live across all continents in the world. There are about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world with sizable minority Muslim populations in places like China, Europe, Russia, and the Americas. And this really speaks to their ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity. And of course, other contributing factors to that diversity is their family, upbringing, level of education, economic status, and the political situation in one's country, as well as degrees of religious observance. So it's really important to recognize that diversity of Muslims to avoid the stereotype that they are monolithic. They are clearly not and can't be, just based on where they live in the world. Therefore, outside of the fundamentals of Islam, there will be a spectrum of views on almost every cultural issues under the sun, women's rights, abortion, LGBTQ, and so forth. It's important to understand that Islam doesn't speak, Muslims do. And when they do it through their lens of education, their economic class, their culture, family, politics, a level of religious literacy, and so forth. Muslims, next slide, are defined by their religious identity, which is Islam. And it may surprise people to know that Islam is not only monotheistic, but it's also Abrahamic, which means that they believe in the God of Abraham, which Muslims have in common, of course, with Jews and Christians. All of the Abrahamic traditions originate in the Middle East, and they're very much united by their beliefs, very similar beliefs and practices. In the case of Islam, Muslims also recognize the Prophet Muhammad, who comes after Jesus and all the earlier prophets before him. Next slide. Like Abrahamic traditions, Islam essentially is a way of life whose practices lead to the cultivation of excellent moral character to better oneself and the world around them. Some of the values that are promoted by Islam are just what you see there on the slide: family and community, life, mercy, justice, and compassion. I'm going to contrast that now with Arabs. Next slide. Arabs, on the other hand, are defined by their native tongue, which is Arabic. They also may define themselves by their ethnicity and country of origin, but as you can see there on the map, lots of ethnicities from, Arabs that define themselves as being white, Middle Eastern, Semitic, Black, and so forth. There are about 22 majority Arabic-speaking countries that you see there listed, with a population that is nearly 500 million people. Majorities of Arabs, of course, are Muslim, but we also have sizable Christian minorities. I grew up in Egypt, and 15 to 20% of Egyptians are Coptic Christians. We also have Druze, Baha'i, and Jewish, or Mizrahi Middle Eastern Jews. In Egypt, also, there was a sizable population of Jewish, Arab, Egyptian folks. Now we're going to turn our attention to Islamophobia. Keep those definitions in mind because I'm going to talk about them a little bit later in terms of the impact of Islamophobia. So next slide. Islamophobia is essentially a framework or a belief system or an ideology by which we view and portray Islam and Muslims in society, not only in the United States, but also around the world. Since this framing of Islam consists of pejorative, negative narratives, it naturally leads to prejudicial attitudes or bias towards Muslims, which then leads to discriminatory practices and hate incidences. These three aspects of Islamophobia, the frames or the narratives or the stories that we tell about Muslims, the prejudice that results from that, and the resultant hate, are often used interchangeably by lay people when they refer to Islamophobia, the term Islamophobia, right? We're going to address the dominant frames first, and the way that we define it at ING is that Islamophobia is essentially a framework. We're going to address the dominant frames associated with Islamophobia, which is very important to do to disentangle it from their consequence, from the consequences. And it's important to actually address the frames to prevent the consequences of Islamophobia. So next slide. The dominant frames are, as you see there. The most common trope is that Islam is culturally incompatible with Western society. Therefore, Muslims are viewed as not belonging. The second is that Islam is a religion of violence. Therefore, Muslims have a propensity towards violence. And the third is that Islam is monolithic. So therefore, nothing distinguishes them from each other. Basically, they're all the same. The picture on the slide is not atypical from how Muslims are portrayed in the media: angry, threatening. The title also reinforces that image: Muslim Rage, How I Survived It and How We Can End It. The author is of this particular piece was a well-known Islamophobe, still is. And I'm now going to describe each of these a little bit in more detail, and then the impact that they have on them, and the impact that they have on Muslims. Next slide. The most common frame or trope is that Islam is culturally incompatible with the West, viewed as not having values in common with Western society, is incapable of being affected by Western values, doesn't influence them, and that the culture of Islam is inferior to the West, backward, sexist, and engaged in a clash of civilizations, which is a theory, an academic theory that essentially claims that by its very nature and essence, Islam is in conflict or at war with the West. And from this, we get America's greatest fears of Muslims living among them in their neighborhoods. So Americans, for example, will protest Muslim immigration, as you see there in the picture on the slide. They'll protest the building of new mosques. They'll attempt to ban Sharia or Islamic law in courts, which never had a role to play except in personal law. Nevertheless, there are campaigns to ban, Sharia. People tend to be suspicious of Muslims running for office or serving the greater community. And this also leads to not supporting religious accommodations in the workplace or in schools due to this fear or concern that Muslims must have an agenda of making America Islamic. So from this trope, a person might rationalize that since Muslims can't be American, then their presence threatens us, since they must be trying to make all of us Muslim. The next slide. The second most common trope is that Islam is a religion of violence and aggression. Therefore, Muslims, by their nature, are perceived by the nature of their ritual practice or appearance, are perceived or considered a security threat. And from that lens, we get government policies like the Muslim ban, the Muslim watch list, which has millions of people on it, never been charged, but that are being watched. You'll get surveillance of mosques, racial profiling in airports, government policies, and even calls for a Muslim registry, which politicians called for repeatedly. The picture on this slide illustrates the trope. The sign the man is holding is basically saying that real Muslims are terrorists. Next slide. And the third trope is what I sort of referred to earlier. Islam is seen as a monolithic block where Islam is essentialized or reduced to a few attributes, which extends to people associated with Islam who are assumed to be all the same. So what happens in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Palestine, Pakistan must be what all Muslims do and how they think. And this leads to guilt by association or collective blame and punishment. So when people ask Muslim Americans, for example, to condemn terrorism, their demands are based on this particular trope. So the combination of these three main tropes is what is used to justify discriminatory practices to the degree that today anti-Muslim hostility is seen as quite normal and natural. Now, when I've asked people, when do you think Islamophobia began? The most common answer is that it began after 9/11, right? Which in the minds of people may justify anti-Muslim behavior. The fact is that it's much older than that. Next slide. It goes all the way back to the Crusades. We find images and stereotypes of Muslims as infidels and aggressive people promoted as early as the Crusades in the 11th century. And those views that were quite common and very much part of European culture at the time, we find those views reinforced again during European colonialism, beginning in the 1400s, which continues until the 20th century. So for 6 centuries, this was taking place. And during this period of time, of course, European colonizers, we're talking about the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, later on was joined by other groups, Italians and Germans I'm thinking of. Essentially, they justify their power over colonized people by defining themselves, Europeans, as superior human beings and describing occupied people in Africa and Asia who were mostly non-Christian as backward, primitive, in need of civilizing, enemies of Christianity and Western civilization. These narratives, which were common in Europe, were carried forward to the United States by European settlers, where we once again see the reinforcement of Islamophobia. How does Islamophobia become systemic in the United States? Next slide. Various American institutions play a part. The most significant institution that reinforces colonial narratives is public education. In what we decide to teach about a people and what we decide to leave out about a people. So in the case of Islam, textbooks and teaching resources often portray Muslims in negative terms and through the lens of extremism, while ignoring the rich history of Muslim contributions to civilization in the sciences and culture, or even contributions to the US since the enslavement of Muslim Africans. It's estimated that up to 10 to 20% of the enslaved Africans were Muslims. In literature, you'll find a plethora of books about the problems of Islam and Muslims. Very little is displayed about Muslims that is neutral or positive. The media is another problem in terms of its coverage of Muslims and Arabs, which is generally negative. In one poll that was done by the Washington Post in 2018, they looked at tens of thousands of articles that mention Muslims or Islam, and they found that nearly 80% were negative, even when the article wasn't covering terrorism. Other studies have shown that news coverage of Muslims is more negative than of other minority groups. Other studies also show that terror attacks by people who claim the religion of Islam in the US receive 3.5 times as much media coverage as attacks by non-Muslims, and so forth. In Hollywood, representations of Muslims and Arabs have consistently been stereotypical. They're improving, but not nearly fast enough. Video games often take place in the Middle East. Popular games like Call of Duty reinforce stereotypes that Muslims are the bad guys or terrorists. And then, of course, we have organized white supremacist and Christian nationalist campaigns against Muslims that have targeted the building of new mosques. And I talked earlier about government policies. So the combination of all of this over the centuries is what leads us to implicit bias. So implicit bias doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of this consistent portrayals of Muslims in negative terms. Next slide. And this leads to the adoption of stereotypes that actually impacts one's subconscious beliefs and will often override professed values, as demonstrated by various studies. So this means that even if a person doesn't believe that they're biased or racist, their subconscious beliefs will cause them to behave in biased or racist ways. And this is especially true in times of fear, war, or stress. And this doesn't just apply to Muslims, of course. It also applies to Jews. It applies to African Americans, Latinx people, Hispanics, Latinos. It applies to Asians, indigenous people, Sikhs, and so forth. Groups that we're not very familiar with. And the important thing here to understand is that this has been going on for centuries, where we have been promoting colonial narratives. The next slide really summarizes what I've been saying in terms of how this affects all of us. Narratives about a people lead to certain attitudes about them and eventually translate to certain behavior towards them, either consciously or subconsciously. So in the case of Muslims, if American cultural values, which rarely change, inform us that men and women are equal, but we believe that Islam teaches the opposite of that value, then our attitudes towards Muslims is going to be very biased, which will eventually lead us to discriminate against them. So above that waterline is the behavior. That's the only thing that we see. In the case of in America, we hold a lot of false beliefs about Muslims as well as other groups of people. The point here is, again, implicit bias doesn't just appear out of nowhere. We've all been subjected to colonial narratives about people over our lifetime as Americans. It stems from a long history of internalizing false beliefs that were created centuries ago by groups who were colonizing other groups. And until we interrogate colonial narratives, both interpersonally and institutionally, we're going to continue to subject people to biased judgments. And I'm talking about all of us Americans, Black, brown, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, Latino, Black, all of us. All of us have been subjected to these colonial narratives, and we have biases that we truly believe are true about people that we haven't talked to, that we're not familiar with. And that's why this work is incredibly important. And I thank the DEI team at your university for doing this work. We're now going to take a look at the impact, next slide, of all of these factors specifically to Muslims. Next slide. As you might imagine, anti-Muslim sentiment increased after 9/11, but in the most recent years, it's has risen dramatically from 2015 onwards. According to one poll, only 15% of Americans have a favorable view of Islam, 37% have an unfavorable view. Another poll showed that 56% of Americans are very concerned about a possible rise of extremism in Islam. Another summary of reports found that 41% of Americans believe that Islam encourages violence more than other faiths. 1 out of 2 believes Islam is not part of mainstream American society, and so forth. And I want you to note here how these sentiments directly relate to the tropes that I discussed earlier. They have an impact on people's attitudes, in this case towards Muslims. Very recently, next slide, according to a major Muslim civil rights organization, there was a 56% increase in reported hate cases between the years 2022 and 2023. This amounted to about 8,000 complaints, the most that were recorded in the last 30 years, even higher than the periods following 9/11 and the Muslim ban. Half of those complaints took place between October and December 2023, which is why we're doing this work today with you. And it's important to note that 20% of those complaints were actually employment discrimination cases. It's also important to note that there's a huge disparity between reported and unreported cases. The ratio is upwards of 1 to 10. And the reason for that is the proximity between victim and perpetrator in workplaces, on college campuses, in schools, where people don't report out of fear of retaliation, basically. We're now going to go over some sort of examples of Muslim experiences which have escalated recently. Next slide. This particular organization, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, has been doing polling on Muslims and other religious groups for the last decade. And the numbers are always showing that Muslims experience higher levels of religious discrimination than any other group. It's pretty close to what Jewish Americans also experience. So Muslims and Jews are the most likely groups to experience any religious discrimination. They just came out with a report yesterday that we haven't poured over yet. But I'm reading the summary. It actually shows that Jews are actually even experiencing a little bit more than Muslims at the current time. We're definitely experiencing more than Catholics, Protestants, and other religious groups. And this includes interpersonal discrimination as in public places like a restaurant, when interacting with peers at work or school. And they also found that Muslims experience it in institutional settings more than any other group in the country. So this includes at the airport, when applying for a job, when interacting with law enforcement, when receiving health care. Another poll found that majorities of Muslims have experienced hate based on their religion in their lifetime. I'll give you one example. I was traveling from San Jose to San Diego, and I sat next to this elderly white woman whom I talked with the entire flight, and she was amazing. She was great, and it's about an hour flight. And as the plane was landing, she looks over to me and she says, "I got to be honest with you, that when I first saw you about to board the plane, I called my daughter and told her that I can't fly on the plane with this woman about to board. She's carrying a bag. I'm afraid. I'm going to, talk to the pilot about this, and because I'm concerned about flying with this person," referring to me as a Muslim or an Arab in her mind. And then she says to me that thank God her daughter talked her down, and she boarded. And so you can imagine her anxiety when I sat next to her. I think it was a Southwest flight. I sat right next to her, and something told me to talk to her on that particular flight. And this is not atypical from experiences of Muslims. How did I react? I was stunned and I just sat in my chair for a while and I didn't get up to leave the plane. Again, these are experiences that Muslim Americans face, especially women in hijab, people that wear the hijab like me. And Muslims have been pulled off of planes for these reasons. So next slide. Another factor is that according to many surveys, again over years, we're finding that 1 out of 2 Muslim families say their child was bullied for their faith, more than double the level of families in the general public. This has been consistent for the last decade. And according to the same survey, 20% of those are experiencing bullying on a daily basis. Next slide. Again, workplace discrimination. Muslims face it when they're seeking jobs or at work. So research shows that Muslim job applicants receive 32% fewer emails and 42% fewer phone callbacks than other prospective employees. And then on the job, while Muslims only make up 1 to 2% of the workforce, they filed more than 20% of religious claims. And of course, many more complaints go unreported, as I mentioned earlier, for fear of retaliation, because proximity between perpetrator and victim. And then on college campuses, next slide. On average, even before October 7th, 40% of Muslim college students were, according to reports, were experiencing harassment and discrimination, were reporting it. That rate, of course, has increased dramatically more recently. So they're experiencing everything that you see there on the slide: verbal harassment, being called terrorists, vandalism of their property, Islamophobic statements have been spray painted on their property, stalking of Muslim students, doxing by digital trucks, driving around campus with their faces being displayed, intimidation by threatening students with statements like, "I will kill you and your family," and then aggravated assault in some cases. In Stanford campus right near my home happened, physical attacks, hit and runs, and violence. And of course, in the worst case, next slide, we see hate violence. In October of last year, the country mourned the murder of Wadi al-Fayoumi, the 6-year-old Palestinian American boy that you see there pictured on the right-hand side. He was stabbed 26 times in his home in Plainfield, Illinois. Wadia's mom, Hanan Shaheen, was also stabbed 12 times and choked, managed to call for help, but it was too late for Wadia. The perpetrator was their landlord, who was a friend of the family up until that point, played with Wadia, helped him build a tree house, and after October 7th, he just went crazy. And according to the police, he was yelling, "You Muslims must die," before assaulting her and then Wadia. In November of last year, 3 Muslim Palestinian students that you see there pictured on the left-hand side were shot in Vermont while walking to visit a friend during the Thanksgiving break. Thankfully, they all survived. The person sees them, turns his car around, takes out his gun, shoots at them, hits all of them. They all survive, but one of them is paralyzed from the chest down. And the police say that they were walking, speaking in Arabic, and also wearing the keffiyeh scarves that you see them wearing in this picture. And then the person at the that's pictured on the lower left side is Zakaria Dor. He was stabbed by someone riding a bike who pursues the vehicle that he was riding in. He yells racial slurs. And so Zakaria and his friends that were in the car stopped the car to confront this person. And as soon as Zakaria comes out of the car, the man stabs him. And thankfully, Zakaria survives that. And I think the perpetrators in all cases have been arrested. And so again, this is the worst outcomes of prejudice, which is why it's so important to be doing the work that we're doing today. Who else is impacted by Islamophobia? Arabs are. Next slide. So next slide. So 63% of Arab Americans, I think we should note up front, are Christian. They're not Muslim, but they're bearing some of the brunt of Islamophobia. All the violent hate crimes that I mentioned earlier had elements of anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian hate in them. Anti-Arab narratives compound Islamophobia, and Islamophobia compounds anti-Arab narratives. So between October 7th last year and March this year, Arab American civil rights organizations have fielded a 500% increase in hate. that have included threats against the staff of Arab American organizations. The picture that you see there on the slide comes from an Arab Heritage Month, which is actually this month, that celebrated in this case, diverse Arab women hailing from different Arab countries. Another group that is impacted by Islamophobia are the Palestinians. Next slide. So Palestinian civil rights organizations have also seen a spike in hate against Palestinians. One reported a 320% increase in reports of hate that were specific to Palestinians. It's important to note here that anti-Palestinian racism is based on very different tropes from anti-Muslim tropes that I mentioned earlier. So for one, Palestinians are an ethnic group. They're not a religious group. Most Palestinians are Muslims, but many are also Christian, Druze, Jewish, and other religions. And the tropes used against them include all of the things that you see there on the slide. And all of those tropes have effectively erased Palestinians over the last 7 decades, while demonizing their supporters and feeding into Islamophobia, and Islamophobia feeding into anti-Palestinian tropes. Another group impacted by Islamophobia are the Sikhs. Next slide. Sikhs are often mistaken for Muslims and are also victims of harassment, bullying, and racial profiling across various institutions. In more than one instance, it's led to violence, unfortunately. The first person to be killed after 9/11 was a Sikh American businessman, Balbir Singh Sodhi, in a violent hate crime against him. Another major hate crime against Sikhs happened in 2012. A white supremacist shot and killed 7 people at a Sikh Gurudwara in Oakland, Wisconsin. Law enforcement believed that the perpetrator thought it was a mosque that he was attacking. Now let's take a look at the impact of Islamophobia around the world. I'm going to say a few words about this. Next slide. Because I'm speaking to college campus faculty and students. And you should know that Islamophobia is now transnational. Next slide. Islamophobia, as I mentioned earlier, Islamophobia starts in Western Europe and then travels to other nations through European settlers that come to lands that became known as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, right? Native Americans, indigenous people lived on those lands before European settlers come. Today, Islamophobia in Europe and other Western nations continues to grow, and it's mostly driven by questions of identity and belonging, questions such as who belongs and who doesn't, what does it mean to you to be European, to be Canadian, to be Australian, and so forth. According to the UN, there has been a rise in discrimination in education, employment, media, the justice system, politics, and social media. And one of the main focuses of some of these hate groups that have been forming has centered around the building of mosques and Muslim women as symbols of otherness, anti-secularism, and a failure to assimilate through bans on hijab, the religious headscarf. So while each country's case of Islamophobia is unique, in some cases it's led to violence. So for example, in 2021 in London, Ontario, a white nationalist man ran down the Afzal Muslim family of 4 people that you see there on the picture on the left-hand side. They were crossing an intersection and they were attacked by a vehicle that deliberately rams into them, and all 4 of them perish. And many of you may recall the violent attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, where white supremacists killed 50 people in one mosque while live streaming the massacre. And this leads to copycat attacks around the world, including right here in the United States. I just want to say one word about this, which is really important for you to remember or to understand, that the perpetrator of the Christchurch attack in New Zealand was inspired by what is now called the Great Replacement Theory, which is a white nationalist conspiracy theory that believes that the white population is being replaced by non-white minorities in Europe and other white majority countries. And this theory blames so-called the liberal elites for the invasion of non-white minorities. The reference to the elites are Jews, and the reference to non-white minorities are mainly Muslims and other non-whites. And this is where Islamophobia and anti-Semitism intersect. and why we do anti-racism work with Jewish Americans, as well as with Black, Hispanic, and Asian groups. So this theory, of course, has made its way to the United States and is espoused by a number of groups in this country in their extreme anti-immigrant sentiments, and it's, of course, espoused by many of our politicians as well. The Buffalo attack in 2022, where white supremacists killed 10 African Americans, espoused support for the Great Replacement theory. The Tree of Life attack, where a white supremacist kills 11 Jewish Americans, attacked that particular synagogue because of their work on immigration. So we just need to keep this in mind. Next slide. In Asia, Islamophobia is also deployed in non-Western nations like China, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, for similar reasons, ethno-national and religious nationalism. But also for perceived threats of the government, as in the case of China. Again, each case is unique, but I'll just mention a few. 1 to 2 million Muslim Uyghurs in China who are indigenous Chinese are currently interned for so-called re-education in Chinese culture, which is an attempt to have the Uyghurs abandon their religion, Islam, or at least sanitize it to the liking of the Chinese government. Starting in 2017, over 700,000 Rohingya people had to flee Myanmar due to horrific violence and persecution against them by first Buddhist monks that were then reinforced by the by the government's military. Over 9,000 people were killed at the same time in what was designated as a genocide. In Sri Lanka, in both 2018 and 2019, hundreds of Muslim-owned buildings, including mosques, were destroyed, again, by majority Buddhists in Sri Lanka. And then in India today, Muslims continue to suffer under a far-right government that discriminates against them with the help of far-right Hindu nationalist groups. And that's all I'm going to have the time for. And now let's talk briefly about countering Islamophobia. And I only have a few minutes. Next slide. I'm going to begin just by talking about interpersonal recommendations. Next slide. Important to start with yourself by addressing your own biases, developing an awareness of your own thoughts and feelings to identify your biases, reflect on them, and acknowledge that even if you don't believe that you're biased, your subconscious may actually lead you to behave in biased ways. Make a commitment to overcoming your biases by, recognizing when you're having a biased thought, reflecting on it, recalibrating, and then repeating this process habitually, and hold yourself accountable when you fail, but don't give up. This takes practice, and this takes consistency in this behavior. It's going to take a long time for us to be able to overcome our biases that we've internalized because of what we're seeing in the public square and how people are portrayed. In the case of Muslims and Islam, next slide, it's important to challenge your assumptions by actually learning more about Muslims. We have a lot of online resources in our organization. We have an entire PowerPoint, Getting to Know Muslims, which is wonderful and has the scripts. And this is available to you. We have answers to questions about Islam and Muslims. I think up to 200 questions now. These are actual questions that we've been asked, which is why they're written the way that they are. And then we have a book list also about Muslims, a variety of different books. And then we encourage you to sign up to our listserv because we're always updating people with new information about the Muslim community. Next slide. I'm only going to be able to do one or two of these slides. Institutional recommendations. Next slide. I think it's important to begin by understanding the circumstances of anti-Muslim hate crimes. The political environment that leads to hate crimes against Muslims, hate incidences, discrimination is the rhetoric in the media and by government officials that disparage Islam in traditional or social media with broad distribution. That's going to lead to hate against them, which is why we saw those spikes in 2015, 2016 during the presidential election period, when many of the Republican candidates were saying disparaging things about Islam and Muslims, calling for things like a Muslim registry. Equally potent is news coverage about wars the U.S. is involved in that demonize the enemy in order to drum up support for our wars in the Middle East, which is going on right now, of course, right? And this is why you're seeing spikes in hate crimes against Muslims. Also coverage of news about international domestic terror attacks, which I said earlier is covered 3.5 times more than coverage of other perpetrators of violence like mass shooters or white supremacist attacks. And then, of course, attacks on mosques, which also lead to copycat attacks. So being aware of this background will help the university administration jumpstart an effort that prevents hate on your campuses. When you do the work on anti-Semitism, you'll see similar circumstances as well. Next slide. Student safety is paramount. That's what we're there for. And here are just a few recommendations that have been very effective in other places. Conducting a climate assessment of student life and experiences and responding accordingly, creating an advisory committee on Muslim and Arab student life, which can contribute to policy, raising awareness of Islamophobia as you're doing right now, not only Islamophobia, but also anti-Palestinian racism through your DEI efforts. So hopefully you'll have another session like this just on anti-Palestinian racism. Responding quickly to all forms of bigotry, putting in place religious and cultural accommodations. Hopefully I won't have any time to go over those, but I can certainly share them with the administration. And then, of course, eventually hire a full-time director of Muslim life if you don't already have one. And then next slide, just a word about employee experiences today, which is really important to keep in mind. Muslims and other employees who support them or who support Palestinians feel all of the things that you see there on the slide. Silenced or marginalized due to their political views or humanitarian concerns related to current events. So even if a person, for example, says, is calling for a ceasefire to stop the violence against Palestinian civilians, they're perceived wrongly as supporting Hamas, right? Which is outrageous. They're mischaracterized by their ethnic or religious identity as supporters of Hamas if they're Arab or Muslim, right? Some employees are feeling triggered and anxious watching on television, reading the news about civilian casualties, mostly women and children in Gaza, which is triggering experiences of events that took place in their home countries in the Middle East that were also supported by the US. We've also been told that what is happening is also affecting Latinx and Asian employees and students who are being triggered by similar situations that took place in their home countries, which were also supported by the US government. So it's not just impacting the groups that you would think, Jews and Muslims, but it's also impacting other folks as well. Fearful and nervous about being charged with anti-Semitism or Islamophobia if they say anything that relates to the events in Gaza and Israel, even if their intentions are only to learn about what's going on. So even employees who are not directly impacted by Gaza and Israel are spending energy and time avoiding certain people or having the conversation altogether. They're bottling it in. And then angry and upset by what they consider to be a hostile work environment or a school environment due to either institutional actions or inactions or for perceived support of one side over the other, or for their actions or for the institutional actions or inactions in addressing concerns. When people have reported problems, too often nothing happens and there are no changes, or they fear retaliation if they do report. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because it's 10 minutes before the hour. Next slide. I have a lot more to talk about, but I had suggested that we might want to just have a session on, maintaining peaceful and inclusive both workplaces and student campus life, just based on the current environment. So, Zach, if you keep just going forward. So, observant Muslims. I'm going to talk a little bit more about not just the holidays, but this here. It's just important to know that observant Muslims do not eat pork or pork byproducts. And remember, I'm talking about observant Muslims. Don't assume it. Get your cues from Muslims, from Muslim students, from Muslim employees. But observant Muslims do not eat pork or pork byproducts, including gelatin. So offering halal, kosher, which Muslims can eat, or vegetarian food would be very helpful. Food handling is very important, where you use different serving utensils for different foods and not the same serving spoons for pork as you would vegetarian or halal or kosher food. Obvious, but doesn't always happen. Some women wear the hijab like you see me wearing, which they do not take off in public for reasons of modesty. So women who wear the hijab, just be aware that they are likely targets of harassment and bullying. Also, for reasons of modesty, some Muslims may avoid partnering with the opposite gender during certain activity. Some may even avoid shaking hands with the opposite gender, something to be aware of in case it comes up, people speak to you about it. It has to do with modesty issues and how they interpret modesty. Some employees may ask to pray the noon and afternoon prayers at their workplace. Workplaces will usually accommodate them with special rooms reserved for meditation or prayer. In my campus where I studied, of course, they had a special room, a Muslim prayer room, which was wonderful. And if you don't have that, then just a meditation room that anybody can use would be wonderful. And now during Ramadan, fasting employees and students may avoid lunch or evening meetings, but most don't mind them. It's just important to be aware of the schedule during Ramadan, where they rise early in the morning for the pre-dawn meal, to have a small meal, go back to sleep, or start their school day or work day. So some employees may ask to change their work schedule during Ramadan to arrive early and leave early. The students, of course, have a lot more flexibility in what they can do with that. But workers will go about their day normally, break their fast on sunset, and then may go to the mosque in the evening for special prayers during Ramadan. For this reason, a lot of Muslims will ask to change their work schedule from late morning to right before sunset, or early in the morning. There are other things to say about this, but I'll stop here. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to cut you off. I heard you take that breath. I thought that was the end. I'm sorry.
No. And I was going to say that it's really important to include Muslim holidays on your calendar. Muslim holidays follow a lunar calendar, and so they rotate around the year. So it's different every year, which is why it's good to update your calendar every year with these Muslim holidays and to try to avoid, having major events on those holidays, not just Muslim, but Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and so forth. And there aren't that many as you might think, or at the very least, announcing them or just celebrating them in some way, shape, or form by the head of the school, I think just goes a long way in helping people feel like they belong on their campus.
We are out of time. Thank you again, Maha, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. For those of you that put questions and answers, we are going to produce a response to all of your questions, so that will be available. Please join us for our next events. We have one later today at 1 p.m. We have more events in May, including a session on trauma-informed care and another session on peacemaking in higher education. You can visit our webpage for more information about the Tritons Belong Initiative by using the QR code that's on the screen. There's also a link in the chat for some registrations and more information. I want to thank everyone again for attending today. Your commitment to learning and growing with us contributes to a positive campus climate. If you have a few minutes, we would truly appreciate you completing our post-event assessment. You can click on it. It's going to be put into the chat. We're going to send out that link via email to all attendees, so you'll get that again. But if you want to do it right now, that's fine. We hope you can join us again at one of our in-person sessions in the spring quarter. Have a wonderful rest of your day and take care.